As Commissioner Yeong noted, the global pandemic has resulted in accelerated development and use of digital systems, including contact tracing. Such systems can clash with privacy rules, create national security risks and cyber attacks, and fuel dissemination of disinformation. These impacts can seriously reduce public trust in government, as well as trust in technology and business. Our next three panelists will provide an after-action report on business and government efforts to address the pandemic and to turn that challenge into an opportunity. Kathryn Condello, you are the Senior Director, National Security and Emergency Preparedness at Lumen, a major American provider of ICT services. ICT is essential for social distancing, enabling people to work from home, learn from home, and order from home. How did companies collaborate with each other and with government to respond to the pandemic?
Thank you, Susan. For those who don't know who Lumen is, and I'm only mentioning it because the name is a new name, we are one of the global tier 1 backbone providers, and we're unmatched in connectivity globally. We have 500,000 global route miles. So we've been working the COVID issue since day one when it started in the Far East. I think the question is a good one, and while some of the discussion around this event is going to be speaking to privacy and trust, I think the first element of trust, which was important and what I would like to speak to a little bit, was the fact that service was available. There was a significant shift in the patterns of the global internet traffic, and this work from home social distancing created a huge restructuring of traffic patterns, certainly in the first 6 months of the COVID. And this shift drove a huge increased demand for both connectivity as well as bandwidth. And so the ICT entities that supported this shift, and these are going to be the network guys, the cloud guys, content, and the collaboration providers, were really, sort of, if you will, held this issue in play. Now, I want to make clear that we already have good relationships with each other, and they're bilateral, and we work with each other regularly to make sure that the services you get are good. But as COVID unfolded, the dynamic nature of all these global traffic shifts led to not just bilateral, but multilateral information sharing and operational coordination. We did this so we could anticipate shifts and adapt our respective networks to be able to meet the changing demands. Now, we leverage this multilateral coordination not only to keep each other informed, but to keep government informed of our operational status, and to also communicate to government, industry priorities, such as the need for personal protective equipment. And we worked with the government decision makers to mitigate those concerns so that we could continue to Zoom. Now, while these traffic patterns did significantly shift, we were largely prepared, and at least in the US, this was a relatively seamless experience for our customers. This collaboration, this multilateral collaboration amongst network, cloud, content, and collaboration during COVID is not the first example of responsible response. This collaboration takes place already in the cyber domain, and we do this to make sure that our customers, our networks are a safer place to operate. Nonetheless, this large-scale, global, multilateral collaboration was one of the mechanisms that we did to sort of operate behind the scenes to support this event. And this collaboration was not just industry to industry; it was also industry to government. I mentioned already that we use this mechanism to be able to communicate industry priorities, such as the need for personal protective equipment. And we also worked in this environment to work with certainly the US and the other nations as well, to be able to refine who are the essential workers that need to continue to work so that we continue to use these content collaboration and media platforms. All that being said, this is one of those environments where I think that we were in a good position based on previous experience, and I think this is also one of these interesting environments where we were able to, even though we weren't ahead of the curtain, the fact that nobody was really complaining was a demonstrable measure of good success. Susan?
Thanks so very much. I'd like to turn now to Gregory Smolynec, your Deputy Commissioner, Policy and Promotion Sector, Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. Greg, what was the role of the Canadian Privacy Commissioner during the pandemic, and what actions did your office take?
Thank you, Susan. Hello, everybody. I'm coming to you from Ottawa, Canada. So privacy, cybersecurity, and trust, of course, have preoccupied our office even before the pandemic, of course. I have to say, what I noticed when I started my current position about 2 years ago, going on 3 years ago, was that there were certain, I call them discourses of privacy, at least in Canada, and I've heard echoes of these discourses around the world that suggested that privacy might be a barrier to innovation, or privacy is a barrier to digitization. For instance, the digitization of government services or to e-commerce. So these are familiar refrains that some people who work in data protection authorities hear now and then. And truthfully, we were always concerned about these kind of discourses, well, not least because we believe that they're not true. Like in our view, privacy is entirely compatible. Good privacy protection is entirely compatible with innovation. It does not stymie innovation. It does not stymie the delivery of digitized government services, for instance. In fact, you could have robust innovation ecosystems and privacy protection at the same time. In fact, you probably should strive for that. So even before the pandemic, we heard about these things. When the pandemic started, we were kind of alert to the possibility that in a public health crisis of such magnitude, these kind of voices might get a little bit louder, that people would be tempted to ride roughshod over privacy protection because of the emergency nature of the situation with COVID-19. So our office immediately alert to these potential, if you will, dangers, wanted to point out that this is not necessarily the case. But also we wanted to make sure that people within our government and within the public perceived us to be part of the solution rather than any kind of barrier, right? So we're conscious of these discourses and we wanted to posture ourselves in a way that is manifestly helpful to public health authorities, governments, and addressing people's concerns about the pandemic. So we did a couple of things. First of all, we very quickly issued guidance on privacy in the pandemic. By the way, the documents I mentioned are all available on OPC Canada website. We also were very conscious of making sure people knew that our approach during this time would be one of flexibility and contextual application of the law. So we have two privacy acts in Canada, one for the public sector, one for the public, and one for the private sector. We want to make sure that all stakeholders and the public and government officials understood that we would have a flexible and contextual approach. And this meant several things. So we worked with our government central agencies to help them develop interim policies for the pandemic on things such as the development and the requirements for developing privacy impact assessments on pandemic-related initiatives and countermeasures that were a little more flexible. We also developed a framework to help government institutions apply important privacy principles. And we helped them apply that framework to various COVID initiatives. And the other thing we did was we sought out and we enhanced our government advisory services and our business advisory services to focus on pandemic-related initiatives, both in the private sector and in the government sector. And in fact, these areas of activity proved to be extraordinarily busy, as you can imagine, for the last, well, since the pandemic started. By the way, our office went to full teleworking in mid-March, and we remain in that kind of a teleworking posture. So one of the big achievements of our office was working with our Health Canada, the federal department responsible for the development of the COVID alert contact tracing application. We, with them and with our Ontario provincial counterparts, we had very productive discussions. We did in-depth analysis of the application from a technical perspective, from policy and legal perspectives, and to ensure that it was in fact a privacy protective initiative. And indeed that collaborative engagement with the government went very well. By the way, just for the record, I'll say government because our office is an independent agency. We are an agency of Parliament, so we report directly to the Canadian Parliament, independent of the executive branch of the Canadian government. And so that went very well. And in fact, across the range of multiple different government initiatives, we had these collaborative engagements trying to show that privacy protection and these initiatives could go hand in hand. And I'd say that the record of our engagement and advice to government and the private sector has been pretty productive. So no issues. We did work with government agencies on things like temperature screenings, also with private enterprises and other initiatives that people were curious about. So all in all, people worked extraordinarily hard, and all in all, I'd call it from our perspective, a success story. One of the concerns, of course, returning to our themes, would be the applications. And it wasn't just the contact tracing application. There are other applications developed for arrivals to Canada and other pandemic-related government apps. And of course, that the safeguards were strong. And one of the things that was very effective in ensuring that stakeholders worked well with us and we worked well with them was that everyone had a mutual interest in making sure that people trusted these apps. Because of course, if you don't have trust, people won't download the apps. They'd be worried about how the apps might be misused, these kind of things. So all in all, pretty good. Virtually all of our recommendations towards the app were accepted. We had some areas of, I'd say, minor lack of consensus on a couple of issues. One thing that came up was that we were hoping that our governments, provincial and federal, would ensure that, so the apps are voluntary, nobody is forced to download these apps, but we were concerned that third parties, like a business, an employer, for instance, might say, okay, show me your contact tracing app results. Did you have any contact with anybody who tested positive? Show us that, right? And we were hoping that some measures could be taken to prevent that from happening. We didn't quite find common ground on that score, but in the event, I'm not aware of any such instances to date. So not an atrocious situation in that score. So anyways, those are some of the things that we've done. And I look forward to hearing from my colleague, Brian.
Greg, quick follow-up question.
Yes.
Before we move on to Brian. What kind of download rate and usage rate did you have from the Canadian?
Okay, so currently there's just under 6 million people who've downloaded the app out of a population of 37 million in Canada, so it's not as good as it can be. The other complicating factor for us is the fact that it requires both federal, provincial, and territorial cooperation between the different levels of government. And so, for instance, in Canada, we have public healthcare, and provincial governments would provide the codes to enter into the app for people who test positive. So there's an absolute requirement for provincial participation in this. Not every province to date has signed up for the use of the app. They may still in the coming weeks and months. Some of the concerns were that the apps may not provide those public health authorities in those provinces all the information, all the data that they require. So there is currently an effort to review some of the functionality of the app, still within with privacy protection in mind, that would accommodate those provincial requests. So not the best, but this I don't know how much of this is lack of trust, how much of it is awareness in different jurisdictions around the world. Download rates for contact tracing apps have not been what they could be. The other thing, of course, is, and this is to the audience, this is a Google Apple API, so you do have to have a fairly recent smartphone, and of course not everyone has such a phone, right? So there is a question of accessibility and access to this technology for people who don't have those phones, right? This is it's a pretty basic yet fundamental issue.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Brian Hendricks, you're the VP Policy and Public Affairs, America's region of Nokia. As we discussed earlier, the pandemic produced accelerated and unprecedented use of broadband for school, work, health, and for daily life. What are your key takeaways and your advice for policymakers going forward?
Well, thank you, Susan. Thank you, IIC. Before I answer that question, I would like to just associate myself with something, well, many things, but something in particular that the commissioner just mentioned, which is privacy is not a limit to innovation. We're technologists. Innovation is what we do. And it's only a limit to companies that aren't paying attention to the regulatory and the consumer protection environment. You plan for innovation. If you have very reasonable safeguards put in place, we find another way to do the things that we're working on. So, and I would say that because we're going to return to this theme probably later in the panel, but particularly in the 5G world that we're talking about now, where we will have lots of vertical penetration into new new ecosystems, new people using the technology, the amount of data that is going to be asked for and created is going to be exponentially larger than anything we've ever seen. If the people who are the users don't trust the system, it will have a massive impact on adoption of the technology. So in no way, shape, or form do I believe that privacy is a limit to innovation. But thanks for the question. I think this is not unique to the United States, but one of the things that we've seen, particularly in the US, is how badly we have done at estimating the unserved entirely and the underserved. And you could be underserved for a couple of different reasons. It can be, poor network quality, or it could be that you have excellent networks, but you don't have the capability of affording the service, or being able to leverage the tools you need to utilize it, like tablets and PCs and smartphones. The mapping in the United States is so bad that what we've basically found anecdotally and also with real-time data collection is that we have underestimated by as much as half the number of people who don't have access to services. In addition to that, we're seeing that those gaps are huge. We have to challenge our assumptions again about the reasons that adoption are lagging. One of the theories of the case that people had in the past was this was an issue of digital literacy for large portions of the population, and that we had a lot of programs to focus on that, and we had great effect from that. But now it's not a question of whether people see the value proposition in utilizing broadband, right? The pandemic has forced all of us, to use it more than we ever did, and for those who never used it at all, to seek out access to it. So where you see continued limits in uptake, you have to assume that there are challenges greater than that, affordability being one of the key ones. And so the hope is ultimately that we will take some time to reflect and collect and memorialize the data and information, and not just from those things that flow into federal governments, but from other sources. I'll just give you one example. We're finding a lot of interest in doing private networks, private wireless networks. A particularly interesting development is the number of schools that have approached Nokia and other partners about the idea of creating limited purpose private networks to serve the neighborhoods that feed their schools. It turns out they have extraordinary data on the families in their school, and ultimately who has access and who doesn't. And for those who aren't able to get online, what proportion of that population were for lack of service, and what proportion of the population were, again, for the devices. And they've been able to utilize resources to get laptops and tablets into the hands of school children, but that still doesn't provide connectivity. So what that's caused us to think about is that a lot of the programs that we have, again, mostly in the US that I'm familiar with, but other places as well, have focused on things like connecting anchor institutions, schools and libraries, which was great. We've achieved wonderful things in that respect, but I don't think anybody seriously conceptualized a time where people wouldn't have access to those institutions. So while we achieved that objective, we're in a situation where people can't get to those places to utilize those resources. So the focus has to be on individual network availability and adoption in the individual home where people are during the pandemic. One of the other things that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to be far more flexible in being technology agnostic about how we solve these issues. One of the things that we're privileged to live in a time where there have been such great advances in technology and capability. And Nokia is a technologist. We provision equipment in all of these sectors. Not just wireless, but fixed broadband and many others as well. We support municipal broadband systems. So from us, this is how we live, technology agnostic. But we shouldn't be picking technologies. We need all of the tools on the table. That may mean low Earth orbit satellite. That may mean other tools in places that are particularly hard to serve. It also means we may need to change the eligibility criteria in some of our existing programs. The FCC uses the eligible telecommunications carrier designation, which is a long-standing approach. It's a means to ensure that the person receiving the money has the capability to build a network, and that is certainly understandable. But the school districts that I just mentioned aren't ETCs. So they aren't eligible to receive the funds, even though they're in a position to potentially create a solution. So I think we have to be a little bit more flexible about defining eligibility for those funds, along with the technologies that can be utilized. And I think that those things alone give us the tools we need to be a little bit smarter about how we allocate our funding from our programs.
Really good point, Brian. Thank you so very much. Kathryn, returning to you for a few minutes. What did you learn over this pandemic period, which obviously is still going on? But what did you learn that surprised you? Was there anything?
Surprised me. I was glad to note, and I was somewhat surprised to note that planning actually pays off. In the work that I do for Lumen, and I work extensively with people within the sector across all the segments, the broadcasters, the satellite guys, the Nokias, if you will. We work on systemic planning, plans that Lumen itself can't fix, and has to either work with our peers, our partners, our other sectors, or with government to sort of mitigate. And 10 years ago, we did a lot of pandemic planning. We did. And while the nature of COVID versus avian flu was not exactly the same, one of the things that bubbled up in that planning 10 years ago was the concept of, we might need to work from home. Well, thank heavens we did some thinking about that in advance. The point I'm trying to make is that this advanced planning and this advanced thought, I'm glad it worked out. but I'm also a little bit surprised that it did. When I think about what some of the success factors were associated, with us being able to do as well, and I'm not in any way dismissing the accessibility to broadband. It's a major issue, but I think it's one that Brian has teased out, and one that we are all as a nation and as a global community aware of. But there were some other things that kind of were interesting to me in terms of how we were able to do what we were able to do and continue to do. One, this kind of bubbles back a little bit to Brian's sort of policy environment. At least in the U.S., ongoing capital investments were really, really, really important. Domestically in the last 25 years, the sector has invested $1.7 trillion in expansion of networks and capabilities and services, and that's an environment. That's a regulatory environment which allows that to happen. And so being able to do that sort of put us ahead of the game. We call it the Wayne Gretzky rule, which was that we were already building, in January of this year, the capacity that we were going to expect for January of 2021, and that provided some level that clearly provided some level of capacity that we would not have had. So, ongoing investments. Again, ongoing preparedness planning. Now, this was important certainly for us, and we certainly have processes and protocols in place, but they really came to the forefront. What I think was more important, and once again is probably not overtly aware to everybody else, was the fact that we were prepared, but more importantly, the fact that other key sectors, whether it was the power folks or the finance folks or the retail folks, were also prepared, made that less of a problem for us and less of a problem for government, and therefore, once again, helped support the work from home kind of environment for the nation. Certainly, we were fortunate, and while there were little bubbles in the supply chain, in general, our supply chains were stable, and I'm not sure that all sectors could say that, but in general, our supply chains were stable. Clearly, the planning supported our ability to do, coordinated response, both with each other, for instance, in the work I was talking about with us and the platform guys, but also with us collectively and government. And the thing that hasn't bubbled up yet is that, at least for the ICT folks, and we'll talk about some of the enterprise aspects of it, we were in a high level, and continue to be in a high level of cyber readiness. So collectively, all these factors allowed us to not be the problem that needed to be addressed by either citizens, governments, or anyone in this space. So, am I surprised? No, because we sort of planned for it. Am I surprised? Yes, because it worked so well. Back to you, Susan.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. And you're absolutely right. Being able to plan in advance and to provision in advance makes such a critical difference. As Brian was mentioning, with the schools and libraries, we had back at the time, in fact, when I was on the Federal Communications Commission, we implemented that portion of the Telecom Act to enable schools and libraries to have connectivity, but we didn't think about the notion of the schools and libraries actually being closed and children not being able to do that, to get connectivity. I'm wondering if Greg is still able to connect with us. I don't see him on screen, and that may be, as we're talking right now, a connectivity problem.
Well,
So
if it's helpful, Susan, I just wanted to add one comment to Kathryn's answer, which is that I actually have been a little surprised about one other dimension. It's a happy surprise. I already told you about some unhappy surprises. The quality of the networks and the capacity that we have, you can attribute it to planning, for sure, investment, for sure. But there was a lot of anticipation, particularly in the wireless space, that we were creeping up on exhaustion of our LTE capacity, as an example. These networks have performed extraordinarily well. And that's a testament, obviously, to the carriers themselves, wired and wireline, and what they've been doing. But it's a testament to a couple of sleeper policy issues as well. One of which, again, in the wireless context, is we've done a really nice job of being reasonably balanced in the allocation of both licensed and unlicensed spectrum. Gives the full toolkit to technologists like us to help, build networks where you can offload traffic during peak times to Wi-Fi and to other secondary networks. That's an important underestimated aspect of things and policymakers. So when we come back to you and it seems like we're consistently knocking on your door asking for more spectrum, it's the issue that never sleeps. And part of it feeds into this, which is that we have to have suitable, not just capacity in a band or a couple of bands, we have to have capacity across lots of different bands to be able to architect flexible networks. Had we not done those things, had we fallen in the trap of, no, that's too much unlicensed, no, that's too much exclusive use licensed spectrum, had we not found the Goldilocks spot, we might not have seen the performance of some of these wireless networks in particular that we have. So that's something to bear in mind in the future about being balanced and continuing to work on bands and the differences between licensed and unlicensed. We need all of it, and it's clearly evident why.
Noting that right now the Federal Communications Commission is in fact engaged in one of the spectrum auctions. As long as I've got you right now, Brian, first of all, let me let everyone in the audience know that we would welcome your questions. If you could use the Q&A button to let us know what you're thinking, and if you want to direct it at a specific person, please do that. You mentioned a little bit earlier 5G. Going from 4G to 5G, excuse me, is not an incremental step. In addition to changing architecture and technology, 5G will usher in exponential growth in data, as well as proliferation of connected IoT devices. Brian, are we ready for the security challenges? And can you also comment on some of the privacy concerns related to 5G and IoT in particular? By unmuting your
people in industry for years have been trying to mute me. It's a big topic, and one we should spend some time on. Let me start by saying, anytime you have a generational, and that's what this is not just, it is an exponential step. There are fundamental changes and advancements in how we're doing things. In the architecture, for example, using a lot more but smaller hardware down to the street level to densify deployments, because we need more throughput, we need more speed, as an example. And we also are virtualizing a lot more of the functions in our networks, in our core, and even in the radio. And software isn't inherently more or less secure, but it presents a whole set of different challenges when it comes to security. So we have to be mindful of that. Overall, the attack surface is going to grow significantly, and this is an area that Kathryn is quite proficient in, dealing with security. And it doesn't just come from the changes in the architecture and the software hardware mix. It also comes from the IoT environment. One of the sort of foundational expectations for 5G is that we will get much deeper penetration, as I said, into vertical sectors. We'll see utilities, we'll see logistics, we'll see transportation companies. And you're going to see a lot more devices, tens of billions of devices attached. And one of the things that's interesting about that is that while that will include companies producing devices that have pretty good heritage, and therefore we have good expectations about their security practice, think device companies, there are a lot of very inexpensive devices that are going to be attached to the network now that don't have that heritage. And basically you can imagine creating some pretty mind-blowing sized bots to be able to do attacks. And and basically our own threat detection capability. We have sensors embedded in hundreds of networks around the world, working with the operators. It tells us that the average IoT device is corrupted in less than 2.5 minutes after its first discovery on a network. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done on the device side of things. The good news for the network side is that this is not a situation like with the internet in the early days, where the focus was so much on speed and ubiquity of deployment that security, although a thought, wasn't the primary driver of how we designed that situation. We know we made errors in LTE. Some of those were things we didn't anticipate, and some of them were deliberate choices because we didn't think threats would be as big as they were. So the first step was cleaning that up. And through CISRIC at the FCC and analogs to it in other countries, we've been able to sort of inventory what those vulnerabilities are and to go back and clean them up in subsequent standards releases. So as one example, things like IMSI catching, which is where you can put a faux cell tower between the user and his tower and basically spoof it into giving up its information. That was a vulnerability that was left in LTE that we worked very hard to patch. So you had all that cleanup work happening. All the companies, all the vendors worked very hard on design for security plans, right, to visualize what the needs were for 5G before we ever began laying down the manufacturing for new equipment. And that design for security process in the case of Nokia is through the whole life cycle of the product. It's in the design of the product. It's in the design of the software. It's in, forensic auditing of our software development and giving auditing tools to our customers to be able to test and audit before deployment. It's in having, 24-hour rapid response and the ability to respond to those kinds of threats. It also means looking at new technologies and approaches beyond those tools that we had. We still have things like, authentication and encryption. Those will be strengthened. Use of firewalls around network elements. These tools are still there. They're still available in 5G, but we're adding a couple of things as well. One of those will be a much greater utilization of automated detection and response, machine learning. And that's important because you take a bit of the human response, and humans, logging into systems represent a security challenge all to itself. So we're going to augment with a lot of AI and machine learning capability in the system. The standards have been well developed. They're very aggressive in how they approach security. And we also have new approaches. Something that people in the audience may have heard of but not truly understand is network slicing. Which is something that will be a really big capability in 5G. And this is the ability on a service or customer specific basis to develop a particular, to dedicate resources to that particular user or that particular application, and to be able to frankly customize the security on that slice. Not all slices will have the same need for security. Some will have heightened needs and will want to customize that security. Some instances, the carrier will continue to operate the slice, and others, you introduce another vulnerability if you use network slicing, which is you may be turning over control of the slice to a third party whose processes and people you have to trust. So all of those things have to have been contemplated before we can even start going down this road. And the good news is they have been. We're not perfect. As I said with LTE, we made choices that we've had to go back and fix. But I think there has been a much greater emphasis on security and 5G development than I've seen in previous places. In terms of privacy, though, I'll go back to what I said with the commissioner, which is if we don't have the fundamental trust of the ultimate users, whether that is the consumer, whether that is the enterprise and their customers, people will not want to use these systems. People will not implement the technologies. They will not adopt the technology, particularly in a pandemic where they're already putting resources on other things. And we have to demonstrate that there's a use case that is compelling. Part of that demonstration that it's a compelling use case is that you're not introducing issues of distrust into the customer relationships that they have. So trust has to be the bedrock of what we do, and if we treat it lightly, we will be massively disappointed with the adoption in the enterprise side, which, frankly speaking, as important as the consumer use case is at the leading edge here of adoption, the real transformational promise of 5G for economies is in its ability to digitalize other sectors of the economy to enhance productivity, whether that is precision farming or smart manufacturing. If you don't have trust, you don't have anything. Like George Michael sang the song back in the day, you have to have, faith, faith, faith. Here you got to have trust, trust, trust. So I'd say we have some work to do there, and particularly in the device side, there is more attention needed here.
Kathryn, did you want to also comment on that issue of trust? And let me throw into this mix as well, and this may not be your area, Kathryn, but there's been some discussion about, once again, about encryption and having a golden key for government, or whatever terminology is currently being used, to limit the end-to-end encryption for security purposes, to be able to identify perpetrators, to particularly in the areas of planning for violence within the country. Would either of you, and I'm looking first to Kathryn and then to Brian, want to comment on that in addition to security as a trust as a
Susan, you're right. This is not really my sort of bailiwick. What I would comment is that, in this changing environment, the thought that there is a key somewhere that can unpack everything, I think that's going to disappear. As we move to an SDN, NFV, network function virtualization, next generation, in the wireline space, we call it next generation, not 5G, but same sort of concept. I think that whole thought process is going to have to be completely revisited, because I don't know that it even applies any longer. Brian, what are your thoughts?
I would say that's right, and I think you need look no further than the emphasis on quantum computing, quantum information services to this very point. I've seen various estimates from people far more expert than myself about what the timeline is for the development both of the ability to break encryption ciphers with relative ease, and the ability to build communication systems that are impervious to that, because they don't rely on traditional encryption. So I think that the intelligence community and the law enforcement community is keenly aware of that fact. I'm not personally involved in the discussions that we have mostly with law enforcement. We have well-defined responsibilities under most countries' statutes. Here in the U.S., it's things like CALEA, to allow for lawful intercept, and we take those quite seriously. We, for example, have gotten out of the business of selling things which can be utilized for surveillance activities on individuals, other than when mandated by law to help. There was a time, and this maybe proves Kathryn's point, where those kinds of systems were much more widely available from equipment suppliers, and you've read stories about how those systems were abused in places like Bahrain and elsewhere. And I think equipment makers said no. You saw a development and a cultivation of really strong due diligence and human rights policies in the equipment space. There are places where today we either won't do business at all, or if we do, we affirmatively disable capabilities in our equipment that could be abused for those purposes. So I think there's a heightened amount of attention, but I do think it's relatively short-lived. The model of communication, the way networks are constructed, they're changing rapidly. We do all have national security agreements with governments where there are certain things that they want us to work with them on, information sharing on threats. They want to understand before we introduce a new generation of technology or an architecture, how is that going to impact lawful activities that governments want to engage in. And I'm not aware that we get those kinds of requests, frankly, in terms of the design of the equipment anymore. So I think that reflects the evolution that Kathryn was talking about.
And Kathryn?
Yeah, if I could just ping pong one more time on this one. Brian was talking about, the evolution of 5G, and I would argue that, COVID actually did a huge quick start push in the public mind, not so much in the enterprise mind, who I think we're already working on it, but in the public mind, or the broadly, broad, small, medium enterprise sort of space. I think we've already done a huge quick start towards next generation networks and technologies. When you consider that the vast number of people that are working from home, or working from anywhere, if you will, they have in essence become the enterprise endpoint from the kitchen. And that is a factor, that distribution of capability that's built into next generation. When you consider the fact that, additionally, people have been able to understand and enterprises in particular have been able to leverage software-defined networking and network function virtualization to be able to enable 70+% of their, employees working from home, they are truly starting to see the value of orchestration. And in that orchestration, coupled with, enterprise policy, which is manifested through the software-defined networking and the network function virtualization, is placing a layer of security in the hands of the enterprise managers that they haven't had before. So in many respects, we certainly at Lumen, and in the first few months where people were scrambling for additional bandwidth and additional connectivity, the feedback we have gotten from our customers that if they were already on a path to sort of automate and move into this next generation kind of capability, the fact that they were able to leverage this next generation capability to be more adaptive and agile during this entire crisis, we have seen a quick leap forward into moving into this next generation technology. Now, clearly, to Brian's point, because it is relatively new, there are always going to be security implications that maybe you didn't anticipate. But to Brian's point, I think as we have moved forward on this, and in all the reports and the analyses that we have provided to all our various government partners, globally, I think security first has very definitely been upfront. Very definitely upfront. And so while maybe the enterprises who are now starting to implement this for their manufacturing firm or their agricultural activities or their baking environment might need to think about it slightly different, the tools are there, the toggles are there, and the switches are there for them to be able to have higher confidence and assurance in the security of their operations using these new technologies.
Kathryn, looking forward, what do you see ahead in terms of new collaborations between government and industry partnerships, and the like? What are the new opportunities for ICT services ahead that you'd like to comment on?
So one, I think if we were not a digital economy in the United States, we are now, and I think we always were, but I think we are even more entrenched in this point, and I think that's going to be experienced globally. So one, we definitely need to address the availability, the underserved and the non-served, globally. So understood and recognized. I do think that again, we are going to be even doubling down. And I sort of change that on sort of that quick conversion to being able to leverage the new technologies and the next generation kind of capabilities to be able to continue to have that level of resilience as an operation enterprise-wide, so that the thought of hiring someone who is half a continent away or in a different continent entirely to be able to work for your company, it is not implausible anymore. We're all now accustomed to doing these kind of collaboration platforms. That too will continue. I think too, in terms of how we as industry, as we move to this next generation environment, we're going to be in a place where, however the enterprise or the consumer wants it, you're in essence going to be leveraging the capabilities of numerous entries, whether it's Lumen and Nokia and AT&T AT&T and British Telecom and Microsoft and Google to be able to create the environment that you want, I think the partnership between these providers will be much more firmly entrenched so that when the enterprise is deciding who are the people that they're going to rely on, what is their trusted environment that they're going to orchestrate their services through, that's going to change how we, or accelerate how we already work with our partners. On the government side, and I think that this is an interesting, sort of pivot point as well. As we move to this kind of environment, I think the government relationships, I think how we work with government is already, certainly within the ICT space, is already fairly well established. But it's going to evolve, and it's going to evolve quickly. Again, I think during COVID, I think we demonstrated that, no, government, you don't need to overly, interject yourself in this. We're handling it. We're keeping you posted. We feel confident. And I think we have started to, create that environment that, no, that they can focus on things that are inherently government. But I do think that it's an environment where we don't do it by ourselves. Whether it was government getting us early access to personal protective, PPE, cloth masks, whether it was government sort of clearing the path so that the states and across the globe, they understand who are the essential workers that really do need to still be out and about. That's an inherently government activity. In the cyberspace, nations' courts globally have increasingly, been able to support civil suits, which then allow people like Lumen or the Googles or the Facebooks of this world to take action against cyber actors to stop the behavior. So it's still a partnership, but it's a partnership that's perhaps different than what we did in, let's say, the 70s. So I sort of view, it's not so much that it will be different, but I view it as sort of an extension and an evolution on a faster speed than of the stuff that we've already put in place today.
Brian, did you want to add your thoughts to that?
Yeah, and I realize this may sound Pollyannish, but I've been doing telecom for a long time, and have done it in the private sector. I've run a committee in Congress. I've been at the FCC, so kind of seen it from all angles. And in the job I have, it's my job to advocate for my company. But this is an instance where we have to kind of look beyond ourselves. And on an industry side, we have to continue to look at the bigger picture, which is working collaboratively with each other and not advocating for things which are exclusively beneficial for our companies, right? So I mentioned the concept of technology agnostic approaches. Everybody has a business case. Everybody has deployed a particular technology, and you're probably not wild about seeing another technology. Welcome back. You're probably not wild about seeing competing technologies. Some of our customers aren't wild about seeing, municipal broadband systems. But truthfully, to tackle some of these challenges, to get broadband available everywhere it needs to be, we need the flexibility to try all technologies and all approaches. From a policymaker perspective, there's just as much responsibility to avoid prescriptiveness and belief, what I call belief-based policymaking, right? Where you start in a proposition that says, oh, free markets can always have to be the answer, or no, I have to mandate X or Y, including a broadband speed. We need to expand the solution set. We need to be able to future-proof networks. And to do that, ultimately, we have to have some pretty frank and candid conversations about what is needed. In the US, there's no polite way to say this. The ways that we allocate money for broadband are broken. We have achieved successes in the past. I mentioned schools and libraries. That was well thought out. Not suggesting that time has come and gone, but at this moment, that's not where the resources need to be. The eligible telecommunications carrier issue is another one. Doesn't reflect the modern marketplace. If we want to make sure that we're not taking scarce resources and just sort of shooting them out into the crowd the way they do with the t-shirt cannons at basketball games, we want real value for the money that we spend, we need to be flexible in design. And that really means define the problems and work backwards to the things that actually can enable the solutions. So here it's, if you're worried about Supplier diversity. You think, Nokia or some of the other suppliers are in danger. Well, let's focus on what you need for supply chain diversity and stability. If it's, trustworthiness and privacy, let's figure that out in ways that aren't prescriptive and don't treat different parts of the ecosystem with different sets of rules. One of the challenges is we want to make sure that networks get everywhere that they need to be. We need to be cognizant that there are business case issues involved there in some instances. And, margins and return on investment are important considerations. So maybe, just maybe, we shouldn't focus on things that limit the ability of, the carriers who are building networks to monetize their investment, as long as the consumer is protected. Right. So we have to be creative. We have to be flexible. And I think the good news is we're getting some real-time returns, as Kathryn said, on consumer expectations. We've been able to stress test the quality of the networks. We're already seeing in real time what some of the new security needs will be because we have more information on the ways that people are utilizing their network connections. We thought this might be far more gradual in the case of 5G, that we would see, a sort of gradual penetration and migration and demand. We're getting a lot of this foist upon us, but the good news is you're getting a lot of returns that are going to help inform policy. But that only works if we're all flexible and try and see a bigger picture. So I don't know, maybe that's Pollyannish to believe that businesses like ours and others will realize there's more to be gained by give a little to get a little. But I think all technologies and all processes should be on the table for review after this.
And if only all companies and governments could be thinking in that direction, rowing in the same direction, it would be wonderful. Speaking of governments, we're delighted to have Greg back with us. Greg, I don't know if you were able to hear the conversation so far. No? Okay. Well,
I'm sorry, everybody. I went to take a nap. And now we're back. No,
well, we were talking
true.
about you the entire time, Greg.
Okay.
So now you can respond. One of the issues that Brian raised that really struck me tremendously is here in the United States, we closed our schools and libraries because of COVID. And it turned out that all of the benefits that we had previously provided to make those schools and libraries to provide connectivity, of course, ended up that children who are at home trying to learn don't have the connectivity they need. And his comment, which struck me once again, we are about 50% of what we thought the connectivity was. So looking to Canada both as a neighbor as well as oftentimes a wonderful example. Can you tell us a little bit? This is again out of your bailiwick, but can you give us any insight into how the schools and libraries and children connectivity for children learning occurred in Canada? Are they in school all the time now? Or are there other issues?
Sure. Right now, here and now, I am personally very sympathetic to people with connectivity problems. Very sympathetic on a personal level. Okay, so schools. What I'm going to tell you is kind of anecdotal, and because I don't have a clear picture of school board policies and attendance across the country. But here in Ottawa, for instance, elementary schools are open. Children are going to elementary schools every day. At the high school level, it's every second day. The classes are divided into cohorts, so it's half the class going every second day to keep the enable social distancing in the space of the schools. And on those alternate days when they're not physically present in the schools, they do have sessions online. So those platforms seem to be working. I think it's less technological and bandwidth issues that are of concern here, at least in our school board, and more of like the familiarity of teachers with how to use them effectively, or if they're teaching in the classroom at the same time, how do you engage the students who are online, that kind of thing. That having been said, it's not the same story for connectivity across the country. So there are certain regions which don't have high-speed connections. So this is not it's not uniform. It's a huge country, of course, with lots of remote communities, and it's not the same everywhere. And there is it's an active policy issue in our governments to address this and to provide high-speed connectivity across the country. So that's to answer your question. But just to make a more general point about the pandemic and what we're all going through is that, of course, and this has been addressed by this panel and no doubt by others, we have this accelerated digitization. So here we are at this conference on this platform. We're teleworking all the time. My kids are spending a lot of time on e-platforms, et cetera. We're socializing. Yesterday I had a call with family to see a new baby virtually. But everything's changed, right? So many good aspects to enable people to stay safe without having to be face to face. But I think one of the important things that we all have to give more thought to is, what are going to be the profound effects of the digitization? So some very good, obviously, to enable us to meet and talk like we are doing right here, or to work, or to socialize, et cetera, or to learn. But with all of these new developments, and to the extent that they persist or become more deeply ingrained and habitual in the post-pandemic era, we have to take stock of what this all means, right? So there are things that we might not be conscious of. Who's recording some sessions? Who's recording maybe sessions with a healthcare provider? What are the safeguards on various platforms? There's a lot that sounds obvious, and maybe it is, but we have to verify these things. So there's a lot that we need to address with all these changes, and then perhaps on an even more profound level, new media may have deeper effects than the what's in front of you on a day-to-day or the various safeguards. And what I'm talking about, and I'll just say, and to get a little bit theoretical for a second, there's a Canadian communication theorist of some renown, Marshall McLuhan, right? And he was famous for at least one quote, or many others actually. He basically said that electronic environments are invisible architectures, and their ground rules, pervasive structures, and overall patterns elude all easy perception. So whether we're talking about contact tracing applications or all sorts of new, maybe pandemic-specific technologies, or things that we're seeing, beyond the pandemic that are, we're all becoming quite used to, we don't know what effects they're necessarily having on that profound level. And if you think historically about some of these things, if you think about what the relationship is between, let's say, the printing press in the early modern period and the rise of the nation state, or the rise of democracy, you see that there are important connections to be made between these epochal historic developments. And I think we're in such a period right now, but we're not fully aware of what all those effects are on individuals, individual lives, individual behavior, societies, countries, the body politic, international relations. We kind of are hinting at them sometimes. Right? We know that social media has affected, how people get their news, for instance. We see the effects, and we're kind of viscerally aware of the effects on our democratic systems. But we haven't fully integrated all the aspects of new technologies on the way we live. And my concern actually is for things like democracy and the future of democracy. And it's not trivial. These are profound things, and it kind of behooves us to think more deeply about various new media and their effects on society and democracy. And unfortunately, I don't think we can afford the lag time. Right? Maybe we could think about these things. Maybe there'll be a brilliant historian who'll come around in 50 years and document the fall of the great democracies. Too late. We have to think these things as we're living them, and we can't afford the the passage of time before we come to terms with what it all means.
This is such a true statement, and something I know I personally am focused heavily on. What has Canada done to address some of the disinformation, particularly with respect to COVID-19? I know this is a little bit off topic, but something of great concern, and since we have the opportunity to have you on the phone, and what needs to be done, and can it be done in a global way?
Yes, so there is a lot of misinformation right now on the internet, on various platforms about COVID-19. Our government sort of seized with the problem and is attempting to counter this disinformation with appropriate, correct, scientifically based information through standard, I think, government communication strategies. So maybe it's a little oblique, what I'm about to say, but I would say that. So getting back to my wheelhouse, privacy. One thing I think that's important to recognize is that, from our perspective, and not just our perspective, but according to international instruments, privacy is a human right. So it's not just a matter of local administrative law or a nice to have. It's actually an inalienable human right. It's recognized as such in Article 12 of the United Nations Declaration on International Human Rights. And by the way, today is International Human Rights Day. So happy Human Rights Day to everybody, including Article 12, which recognizes privacy and the right to reputation as an international human right. I think probably most participants' countries are signatories to this international declaration. So if you recognize this, you also start to recognize or think about the connections between privacy and its connection to other human rights. So how does political micro-targeting work, right? There is, in fact, a collection of personal information that greases the skids for disinformation. So it's not completely unrelated to the collection of personal information. So without getting necessarily too deep into solution spaces, recognition of privacy as a human right, recognition of the importance of privacy protection through the application of various internationally recognized privacy principles, actually having privacy protective program management in various, in government, but in private sector as well. These things will provide the foundation upon which other rights and freedoms also rest. So this is not disconnected to political micro-targeting. It's not disconnected to the abuse of personal information in electoral campaigns or the spread of extremism online. So these are kind of general themes I'm highlighting without necessarily providing specific solutions, but I'm a bit hesitant to prescribe solutions to various countries.
Thank you, Greg. And I just know Canada is in sync with the European GDPR for privacy, and we're still working on privacy in the United States. We only have a few minutes left for the conversation. I want to invite both Kathryn and Brian, first of all, and then you, Greg. Any questions you want to ask of each other, or any points that, specific points that you want to pick up in this conversation? Kathryn, your turn.
I'd like to pick up on Brian's sort of technology agnostic kind of comment. I think, we as an industry are in a sort of a transition point. And I think Brian's, point about being technology agnostic is what we will see 10 years from now. I know that, Lumen, we consider ourselves a platform. And we consider ourselves a platform for connectivity globally, to whether it's the Wi-Fi guys or private wireless or the traditional wireless guys or the satellite guys or the content platforms. We view ourselves as a sort of relatively technology agnostic platform, one where we play a specific role in terms of either executing on solutions or providing global transport. So I think Brian's point is well made, and I think it'll take a little bit of time, for industry to kind of, work towards that environment. I think our customers, and I think the enterprises, and I think governments, once they realize that they can orchestrate their own environment, will help accelerate that. To Brian's point, if we know our customers care about privacy, well, then we'll build privacy in. If our customers recognize that they want to orchestrate their own environment, their own network, their own capabilities, their own services, with certain trusted partners, I think that's going to help accelerate the way to which we do rise above many of the issues that we're dealing with today and sort of be looking more forward. So hats off, Brian, for stating better than what I was able to convey.
Well, at the risk of undoing the impression of me as a visionary, I was actually being a little bit more parochial. I was speaking, that was basically a message mostly for policymakers. And what I was driving at is, everywhere you look, you understand that there are companies with business cases that they're looking to advance. And I'd love it if, the FCC allocated more funding for this type of activity because it'll drive growth in a particular business group for me, et cetera. What I was really suggesting is that I think if I'm a policymaker, which I was once upon a time, I'd be more interested in defining capabilities and expectations of what we'd like for the users out there, including what can help us future-proof the network. Because the last thing you want to have to do is go back and rebuild networks every couple of years because you didn't have a plan to actually monetize it properly, or you had the wrong mix of technologies, and we got to go back to places because now they've got networks that can't support the activities that are needed. So I totally understand the desire, for example, to prescribe a certain speed threshold. But if you're not careful about that, you do actually pick technologies, right? Unwittingly, perhaps. If you said it had to be 100 megabit per second the day you turn it on, then perhaps there are fixed wireless solutions that could be a real problem solver at half or 3/4 of the speed today that aren't on the table. And that may mean in some instances that a community doesn't get served. All I was suggesting is that we want to allow for the possibility that satellite, if Starlink and others prove to be, as robustly available, and they're in areas that prove very feisty that we can't otherwise get services to because a business case doesn't exist, or you're dealing with a situation where a fiber to every home means trenching through, a mile of solid rock in the hill country of Texas. You need to be able to take a look at other technologies. It's easier to do if you define capabilities and sort of a future vision, and then say, okay, fine, what technologies out there can do that? And let's make sure that the programs we have allow for them to be eligible for support. Let's not overly constrain our solution set. But yes, to Kathryn's other point, companies will also have to be technology agnostic. We have that in our DNA because that's who and what we are. We're a technologist. People tell us you have a problem that needs solving. We make the product, right? Wireless, wireline, you name it. But I do think we have to be careful we do not constrain ourselves in the today by saying it has to be that speed and it has to be that, that capability, because when you then look, there may be solutions out there that can bring real relief in the situation, and then, can be innovated and grow over time and keep pace, but you've kept them off the table because you've overly constrained yourself. That's what I was really speaking to.
And Kathryn, you looked like you were interested in responding to that. No.
I'm not going to disagree with him. I'm not disagreeing with him at all. I mean, certainly, it's been our experience that in trying to solve problems, that some of the parameters set, in particular by the regulators, in essence precluded an answer. And so I'm not going to argue with Brian on that one.
So a multi-stakeholder with government approach to regulation may may help to avoid some of those problems, or adoption of industry/public development of some of these approaches might be one way to go. I'm looking at that certainly in terms of online video.
Yeah. I think Greg's phrase, and when he was talking at the very beginning, which was like flexibility and contextualizing, I think is the mindset for solving some of the bigger problems, whether it's availability globally, whether it's the privacy issues, trust issues. You have to be able to put it in context. It's sort of a risk management approach, but it also, I think, provides and lends itself to higher levels of innovation.
Greg.
So Brian's comments evoke the question, like, not for future-proofing the technology, but how do you future-proof privacy law, privacy regulation? So this is a challenge I think privacy and data protection authorities around the world have faced. So our privacy laws, which are currently being looked at, predate, for instance, the Public Sector Act predates the internet. The private sector law is now 20 years old, and it didn't anticipate some of the media that we now use daily. And basically, I'd say, like, to borrow a phrase from the military, we're not really pacing the threat or the privacy risks. So technology is evolving at such a pace, Internet of Things, just imagine it, right? And people's behaviors are changing, that the law and regulation has had a problem pacing the change in technology and people's habits and uses. So there's no easy answer to this, but going back to something I said just a few minutes ago, from our point of view, if you do think about privacy in a certain way, for instance, as a right, it will have an effect on how companies, how government institutions come to the problem of privacy, how they approach it, how they consider it. And it will also provide, depending on what legislation may look like, if you should be able to, for instance, incorporate interpretive clauses into legislation and regulation that situate privacy in this way as a right. It'll provide that basis for the judicial system to interpret the various interests accordingly. So I think privacy as a human right is a way of thinking about privacy that will, it's not only universalizes the issue globally and geographically, but also temporally too. I think it has a helpful effect of future-proofing how we think about it.
So let me just add very quickly, if I was smart enough to know how to future-proof and advise people to future-proof networks, I'd be in great demand. But I would say this, this is an overused term in the business advocacy vocabulary about predictability. But lack of predictability in our space as a technologist is very difficult, because I can plan for to innovate, as I said, in a system where we have well-developed rules of the road that we think are going to be anchor foundational expectations going forward. Whatever people think of GDPR, it's there. We know what it is, and you know what you have to do in an expectation. In a place like the US, where we don't have those guideposts, but we have the debate, where we have issues like net neutrality, whatever your views on that are, that put us on a perpetual hamster wheel of regulation. Will it, won't it, will it be there, won't it be there? It's difficult to build innovative products that our customers demand, that have capabilities like caching, help them monetize, the infrastructure better, consume less power, etc. If you think there's a reasonable expectation that the next change in administration is going to bring a whole different approach on those key issues. So certainty in this respect actually unlocks innovation. So I would say that part of future-proofing is having a predictable regulatory environment, whatever that is. We can innovate in the environment that protects consumers if we know what the rules are likely to look like, because you do have an expectation it's a human right, and you have to provide the protections that treat the data that way. You can still monetize data on an anonymous basis, etc. But we do have to have some guideposts that we don't think are going to flip around all the time.
Thank you, Brian. I'm afraid we are out of time. And so that's the last word. So I know I've learned a lot in this panel, and I appreciate greatly the participation, first from Zeke and Yeong, and then Kathryn, Gregory, and Brian, for your insights into how we're responding with ICT and COVID, and where we're going in the future. So thank you, and thank the IIC for this opportunity this morning.